Sitting here with Sam Harris, the Sam Harris, with Samantha.
Don't do clickbait. I don't want your listeners to think you've managed to get Sam Harris on board.
Oh no, I love him.
Yeah, but I mean, they're going to want to listen to it, and then they'll be disappointed. No,
well,
not.
Yeah, definitely not. You're the second famous Sam Harris. I'm sitting here with Samantha Harris, my beautiful colleague and PhD period office mate.
It's true.
We shared an office, and I have thought about it. We did share an office for 2 years and almost a half.
Yeah?
Yes, we did. Like, I thought about it.
A long time.
Thoroughly, yes.
That's a long time.
We shared a lot of plans.
We did.
Tea.
Lots of tea.
Lunch breaks.
Fruit leather.
Seated yoga.
Lots of silly looks.
Yes. And toward
Giggles.
toward the end, we both were losing it. We were lying down on the floor on the yoga mat and playing with that huge ball in the office.
Bouncy ball.
Yeah.
We kept each other sane.
Yes.
Thankfully.
But I never knew what you actually do. Like, I knew that you are working with mental health of immigrants, but I had no idea that what you actually do.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that at some point you had to interview some physicians, family doctors, and that was a part of your project. And I was like, good for her. But I didn't know what you really do.
We never really spoke about work, did we?
No. Not with
the topics that we were working on.
But then at some point I attended your defense because you're my friend, basically, not because I was interested in attending defenses. And then I was amazed by how important and precious your work is. And I really like your group in Bergen, actually. And
shout out to Society and Workplace Diversity Group in Bergen.
Yes. What they do is really, really important for us, for immigrants. And I think it's really worthy. And then I had to read your thesis as well. That part, it was only because I was interested. And you have good English. And then I noticed that what you do is amazing. And then you got a postdoc.
I did.
At the University of Oslo.
Where we are right now.
Where we are right now, yes. So we moved to Oslo. I moved to Oslo before Sam, and then Sam defended, and she also got a position as a postdoc in Oslo. And now you're still working on the same thing, and you are writing project proposals regarding the same thing, and which is amazing. But I want to ask you, what was the main and the initial motivation to start working with the mental health of immigrants? And could you actually, this is really important, could you actually tell us the difference between being an immigrant, being a refugee, being an asylum seeker? Yeah,
for sure. Okay. So I'm going to first of all start by just clarifying the concepts, because I think that's a very good question. And a lot of students also still get confused about what actually is the difference, right? So the way that, and I'm not sure everyone would agree, but this is the way that I see it and how I've seen it mostly in the literature, is that the term migrant is kind of like an umbrella term that describes anyone that has moved across countries for however long, apart from a tourist, of course. Someone who moves to live in another country. And now within the concept of migrants, there are several subcategories, such as asylum seekers, refugees, voluntary migrants. So the difference is that particularly refugee and asylum seeker, I think, gets used interchangeably sometimes. And the difference is that, yes, both of them are what's referred to as forcibly displaced. So meaning that they've been forced to flee, often because of fear of being persecuted, or there's war, conflict in the country. Basically, they can no longer live there safely. But the difference is that refugees, when they seek asylum, their asylum claim has been accepted. Whereas asylum seekers, their asylum claim has not yet been accepted. So they're in kind of a limbo phase, making them a very vulnerable group as well, because they don't know yet whether they're going to be able to stay.
Oh, yeah. So they found a way to get to that country, and then they seek asylum, and they're waiting for...
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly. And in terms of my motivation for going into this topic, because you've observed quite rightly that this is pretty much what I've dedicated the last few years to and what I'm continuing to dedicate my time and my work to. So initially, when I was studying psychology, I wasn't really sure I found everything fascinating. And I already knew that particularly abnormal psychology, I always found very interesting because it tells us something. When you look at the things that go wrong, it tells you something about how things work, right? And I remember that I went on a world trip before I was going to do my master's. So I had applied to UCL to do a master's in clinical mental health sciences. And while I was on my world trip, I was traveling to places like Cuba and Laos and Cambodia and Sri Lanka and India. And I was really like exposed to all these completely different types of cultures. And honestly, I think it helped me become a little bit less ethnocentric. I was in my early 20s. I'd really only experienced Europe properly. And it kind of made me a bit more like, oi, there's all these other interesting cultures that see things in such different ways. At the exact same time, this was 2015-16, it was the refugee crisis. And I remember that it just really, really struck me how difficult some people, how difficult the situation was that some people were in, having to flee to a different country, having to live, fleeing from your home where things make sense, where there's, war and destruction, to another place where things are very different. And so I found myself thinking a lot about what impact does that have on you and your well-being and your mental health, and then what happens when you actually want to seek help, or kind of, is there a way of helping people? And I discovered very quickly that there is a treatment gap. So the higher proportion of people with mental illnesses among migrants, but an underrepresentation of exactly these people in health services. And I just think it's a very interesting issue to examine, and that's why I'm continuing to spend time on it. So I guess the short answer is the refugee crisis, as well as a bit of an awakening of my own.
I have a very important question. Can you tell us a little bit what ethnocentrism mean?
Yes, of course. So ethnocentrism is this kind of perspective, or I'm not really sure what to call it, but attitude that everything revolves around your own ethnicity or your own culture. So there's kind of an element of not really being aware so much of other cultures, and maybe also a little bit of at least I associated with a bit of arrogance as well. Ethnocentrism being sort of like everything revolves around us and nobody else. Like, we don't really understand other people.
I remember Vivian Woodfin. During her defense, she had a trial lecture that she needed to talk about ethnocentrism and self-compassion. Yeah. And that's how I got to know this concept exists. And I noticed when we say like doing it the Persian way, or celebrating the Christmas the Norwegian way, that's because there's only one way that we know, and we are not aware that how amazing it could be in other cultures. And this is what I remember from Vivian, that it's like subconsciously we become actually a little bit arrogant and also a little bit like selfish about our own culture. That's amazing.
Yeah, kind of shut off maybe also to other cultures.
Yeah. Okay. So getting to the depth of your project during your PhD, as I said, I remember that you were interviewing doctors, physicians, to know how they approach when they have a patient a client that has a immigrant or a refugee background and come to them with a mental health problem. First of all, my question is that when you go through the literature of immigrants and refugees, what type of mental health problems do you usually encounter? And can you tell us a little bit about the range of that? And also, can you tell us how doctors actually approach those mental health problems, and how do they um, uh, basically are they sitting there with open arms for the refugees? Do they have deep understanding of the refugees and immigrants and their type of problems? Like, is it tangible for them?
So first of all, I want to take a step back. When we're talking about prevalence of mental illness among migrants, a lot of the studies, particularly in Scandinavia, are based on what's called registry studies. So obviously, maybe the listeners don't know, but in the Scandinavian countries, we have these national registries with information on all people that live there, including their diagnoses. So that's obviously for research purposes amazing, because you can get quite, or in theory, you can get quite an accurate estimate of a prevalence of mental illness. However, and this is exactly kind of the basis of my research, that a lot of people with a migrant background will not seek help, which means they'll never be captured in the national registries. So the prevalences that we kind of observe from the registries might actually be an underestimation of the mental health problems that people with a migrant background actually are facing. Having said that, the types of, obviously, when we say migrants, it's a hugely heterogeneous group. So it's actually very difficult to say what is the prevalence of what mental disorder among migrants, because within migrants, we have obviously voluntary migrants from a variety of different countries that come here to work. Exactly. We're kind of sometimes referred to as economic migrants. We kind of came here to work because we got a job, and yeah. Then there's refugees and asylum seekers, and maybe unsurprisingly, it's exactly the forcibly displaced migrants that face higher rates of, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. And when it comes to the voluntary migrants, there's still, sort of challenges with discrimination or with problems integrating into the society that can increase rates of mental health problems. But then it'll be kind of higher rates of depression, anxiety. In refugees and asylum seekers, I think there's also a higher prevalence of psychosis. Actually, there's quite a bit of epidemiological work that looks into psychosis risk, but I honestly couldn't tell you the exact prevalence. No. And then your second question was about the physicians. So again, I want to take a step back. In my master's thesis, before I did my PhD, I did one of those big epidemiological studies where I used registry data from Sweden to look at the rates of substance use and post-traumatic stress disorder among Swedish people, non-refugee migrants, and refugees, and found that refugees had higher rates of PTSD, but lower rates of substance use disorders, which is, I think, kind of is logical given, for example, the cultures that people might come from where drinking and taking drugs maybe isn't as common, right? However, we see also that over time that changes. The longer you've been in a country, the more likely you are to maybe behave more like the people in Sweden. So the substance use goes up over time. But anyway, so
also it sounds like, just to add, it's some type of destructive coping strategy for the mental health problems that could be amplified by immigration. And
I think so too. I think it could be a form of self-medicating at some point. But what I found frustrating about the registry study was that you're really kind of at the mercy of what's being captured by the registries. And I started being very curious about, well, what actually happens when people go to get help? Like, how, this exactly your question. So how are they being met by doctors? So the very first thing I did in my PhD was I went and I spoke to the doctors. And I asked them in qualitative interviews, I asked them, when you meet people with a refugee background that you suspect of having mental health problems, like, describe that to me. How, what are the things that work well? What are the things that aren't working so well? Do you have any, reflections around that? And it turned out that one of the big issues, and this is something that we find in the literature a lot, was language barriers. Is this question of like, how can we talk about something as vulnerable as mental health when the patient might not be comfortable speaking Norwegian? They might not be comfortable using an interpreter either, because the interpreter might be from your community, or you don't feel like they're really translating exactly what you want them to translate.
Emotions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, but it wasn't just that communication was purely language. There was also something about, someone described it as different horizons of understanding, which I kind of understood as cultural differences. Having a different way of describing maybe your pain, or, the fact that you're really struggling. And that's something that doctors found very difficult to handle, because they're like, okay, is it depression? Is it headache? Is it stomach ache? Is it, anxiety? What's going on here? So, yeah.
You mentioned the notion of integration. I have a question for you.
Okay.
Could you tell us the difference between integrating with the culture, just to take away those cultural barriers, when you're an immigrant or a refugee, with what assimilation could be, which is, to me, basically assimilation. I learned this word from developmental psychology, which is just basically a phase in development, right? But when it comes to refugees and immigrants, to me, it feels like if you assimilate with the culture, it's like dissolving your identity and just dissolving yourself in a new culture and just basically just losing your identity. And sometimes I do think about, how much am I supposed to integrate? To what degree am I supposed to integrate? Am I supposed to assimilate, or am I supposed to integrate? And which one is going to help me with my mental health?
So yeah, there's a whole field on this. The field of, well, the concept is called acculturation, which is just the phenomenon when two cultures meet and the changes that occur in those two cultures when the cultures meet. There's been a lot of focus on what changes occur in the migrant, so in the new kind of, migrant culture. And now more recently, there's more focus also on what changes occur in the majority culture. So in our case, for example, the Norwegian culture, that changes because we've come. But typically when you're talking about integration, of course, the focus is on the migrant. And in this acculturation model by Berry, he has specifically integration and assimilation as two different ways of, or different changes that can occur in this acculturation process. In integration, and you've summarized it very accurately, that integration is, or assimilation is, that you give up basically your heritage culture. That could be, your traditions, your ways of seeing things, and you completely adopt the new culture. And integration is that it's a bit more, I like to think of it as a bit of like a mix and match, like sweets bag. You pick the things that you like from your own culture and you keep that, and you pick the things that you like from the new culture and you keep that. Or not necessarily only the things you like, but the things that serve you. The things that, for example, learning the language might help you get a job. But something that I want to really highlight when it comes to acculturation is also that I don't want to think about it as a static thing. It's not like you arrive and you decide, I am going to integrate, and then in every area of your life, you are integrating. But actually, it's, first of all, dynamic, so it changes over time, but I think it's also context dependent. So taking me as an example, I would say at work, I'm very integrated, or maybe even assimilated. I speak Norwegian. I have my lunch at 11:30. These are very typically Norwegian things. But then when I'm with my friends, or when I'm in a different arena, then I would say I'm more integrated. And maybe if I'm with English people or with German people, which is like my own home cultures, then maybe I would be almost more separated, which is this, the concept of kind of keeping to yourself and only speaking your language, maintaining your culture without adopting other elements. So I think you can think about it as a bit more fluid than just being integrated or not.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Now I'm thinking about my life, and I think it's really context dependent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think to your final question, what will serve your mental health best? I reckon being able to choose, being able to kind of move between them in a dynamic way. Um, so I think a certain level of integration, and this is now mostly anecdotal, even though there's also research on it, but I feel like a certain level of integration, like learning the language and understanding certain values in the new culture, will allow you to adapt in a better way. There is a lot of research. So Barry, he proposes this integration hypothesis, where he suggests that actually integration is, of all of these different ways of acculturating, integration is the one that will give you best psychosocial adaptation. So that
Okay.
he would argue that that's best for your mental health. Not everyone agrees.
Amazing. I remember I was talking to one of the people from your group in Bergen, Valeria Markova,
Mm-hmm.
our previous colleague. And she was telling me that you don't need to assimilate and just lose yourself, but you do need to integrate to some point to make sure that you will be able to function in that society. Otherwise, you will be isolated, sitting at home, and not being able to get a job, not being able to have friends, especially
Exactly.
refugees that are alone.
But what's also a bit funny about integration is that we see that when people get a job, and when migrants get a job, their integration shoots up, right? They learn the language much faster. They have a Norwegian social network. But on the other hand, if you're not in, or if you don't speak the language, then getting a job is so much harder. So you end up in this kind of almost like a catch 22 type situation where you're like, well, I can't do that without speaking the language, but I need to get the job to learn the language better. And I think a lot of us who are migrants, obviously we're in a slightly more privileged situation, but even we, I think, have experienced some of that frustration of like, well, I can't do that without that. And then not really necessarily getting the support that we could have benefited from, or having to navigate the system that's completely new and like, oh God, how do I get my ID number? How do I, yeah.
Okay, so I have a friend that now she has actually she just got her Norwegian passport. She has no problem for help from the health providers. But before, when she lost her job, because because the company that she was working for, they were basically broke at some point, and they all lost their jobs, and it was a really tough period of her life, like multi factors that affected her mental health. And I remember I told her, this is where you should go to the doctor and talk to them and talk about your mental health problems and tell them that you're basically not only burn out by the job that you don't have anymore, because she was working over hours hoping that they can save the company, but also like you really need it. I can see that you really need to talk to a doctor, and if there's the need, they will refer you to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And what she told me is that, I'm afraid that if I go to a doctor and talk about my situation, and it's written my history and it's in my journal, and one day if I apply for my permanent residency or my passport, then they are going to see it, then it's going to affect me living here. So what I feel like is that there's so many people with immigration background and so many refugees that they actually don't even seek help.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. So I think that there's many different reasons for not seeking help. I do want to stress that there definitely also are people that want help and who maybe can't get it because they're being potentially turned down by the healthcare service, or there's other barriers. And then there's people that you're describing who also don't want to seek help. And within that, there's different reasons for not wanting to seek help. On the one hand, there's maybe preferences. And at this point, I want to say that I don't necessarily think that getting psychological support is the be all and end all. I think that a lot of people are amazing at coping by themselves and using those coping mechanisms like their friends or family or exercise or religion, ways of coping. So I'm absolutely not saying that everyone should seek help, but then there's other people who don't want to seek help because they don't know what the consequences are. They don't know, is this going to affect my job? What will my employer find out? And I think that goes hand in hand with the system not really being that clear. So the ability to navigate the system, and what's the difference between UDI and the police and my employer and the healthcare system. And then, like I said, we have these registries. So all this information about you is in the registries. So I think there can be some sort of like confusion about where is this information going to end up? And that, coupled with stigma around mental health, I think can cause some people to think, you know what, I'd rather not. Yeah, so I definitely think that's, yeah.
I remember my own challenges when I was dealing with burnout and depression. My psychiatrist from Iran, he has been my psychiatrist for many years, and we were in contact online. And I remember I telling him that I'm on a sick leave because I can't work. Like, I get an email and I get like panic attacks just because of one email. And he was like, "But you have to go to work at some point." And then I was talking to my father about it, and he was like, "But don't you think that taking this sick leave and just not working for some couple of months, it's going to affect your CV and what your boss thinks about you in the future?" But at the end, you want a recommendation from them when you want to apply for other jobs, right? And I still think about it. Like, I still have it in the back of my mind that my mentor or my boss is going to think that, oh, she was on sick leave for almost a year because of her depression and burnout. I'm going to remember that. Not the best employee, like not the employee of the year. So it is like still a lot of taboo, still a lot of stigma around it, a lot to ask for. And even like a person like me, I was very open to ask for mental health advice by the professionals. And I went to my doctor and I was keeping contact with my psychiatrist in Iran. But once you get such feedbacks from people that are basically your significant others and your mental health provider, your healthcare provider, you're like, oh my God, like, why am I not functioning?
I think the point about sick leave is really interesting because I think that there's a huge amount of stigma, not only around certain like mental health conditions, but I think specifically um, for sick leave. I think a lot of people feel guilty taking sick leave and are afraid, exactly like you're describing, what impact it can have. We did a study, actually, like a little experimental study, where we showed doctors four different. So doctors were randomized to see one of four different videos, two of which were a Somali man and woman, and the other two were Norwegian man and woman. So we hired some actors and they presented identical symptoms that are in line with depression. And then we asked the doctors, okay, if this was your patient and this was the information you had about them, what would what would be a tentative diagnosis and what would you suggest as, the next steps or treatment? And then we could compare whether diagnoses and treatments were different for these different groups. And overall, we saw that there were very small differences, but one of the most striking differences that we did find was on sick leave. And we found that we found a difference between that the female Norwegian was far more likely to get sick leave than the Norwegian man. And this was something that we find in literature, so that women who show symptoms of depression are more likely to get sick leave than men. So that wasn't a huge surprise. What did shock me a little bit was that the Somali woman was not more likely to receive sick leave compared to the Norwegian man and the Somali man. So that kind of left me thinking a little bit. So on the one hand, we have this issue of people maybe not wanting to take sick leave. And then on the other hand, maybe there's also something about doctors being less inclined to give sick leave to certain migrant groups. Of course, this is just based on like a relatively small sample and just one study, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure that's been investigated again in more detail, but it still makes you think a little bit. What's the difference here? And so I was reflecting a bit, because it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. It could be like what your doctor said to you. It could be an idea of like, but work is good for you, right? Yeah. So it doesn't only mean, oh, this person, you know, I'm not going to give them sick leave because I don't want them to, whatever, take advantage of the system. It could also be, actually, it could come from a good place. How did you feel when your doctor said that to you? Did you feel like it was because they wanted you to continue to be involved in work, or?
Well, it was my psychiatrist in Iran, and the way it was not actually with my doctor here. I was the one that at some point I said, I want to go back to work.
Right.
And she said, okay, take it slowly. You think you're totally right now, but I suggest that you go back to work 10% more each month or each other week. So that's how I came back to work 100% at some point. And I think it was a really good idea, because I started to answer emails with that 10% all the way to 100%, getting into data analysis, writing papers, and everything that we do. But my doctor, like my psychiatrist in Iran, I think it was more like, I mean, it was more like I could see it implicitly. It was like, I don't see that it would help if you sit at home. Like, what's the point in that?
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't give him this message that it's really hard to even deal with emails at this point of my life, let alone thinking these cognitive skills of looking at yes. Yeah.
I find that very interesting, because it really highlights that our decision to seek help is not purely our own. And I think particularly for migrant groups, and I've just recently submitted a paper about this, where I've investigated social norms around help seeking. And I think that particularly migrants are going to be influenced by what they think is normal for them, for their group, from their home country, as well as what they think is normal in Norway. Yeah. Right? So you kind of have these two, and sometimes they might be conflicting. And in addition, you might have the norms from your family, like your father. When you were describing, you know, he was like, oh, maybe you should go back to work. So I think when it's obviously that was about sick leave, and I'm now talking about help seeking, but I still think that that's also something that we could be a bit more aware of, that there are potentially these conflicting values or norms around, you know, is it okay to seek help actually? And is it something that, so in the study that we were doing, we asked people how likely or how willing they would be to seek help. Then we asked them how willing they think others from their country of origin would be.
Study, yeah.
And then we asked them how willing they think Norwegians would be to seek help. And we saw that people consistently thought that others from their own country of origin were less willing to seek help, but they thought Norwegians more willing to seek help than themselves. And they were somewhere in the middle. And I think it just shows that it's not so easy also making that decision. You're going to be influenced by, you know, your friends, your family, other people. Like, yeah, I think that could be worth keeping in mind when it comes to this topic.
Yeah. Can you say something about what would these values and norms be that could prevent you from seeking help on cultural level?
I think one could be, for example, a culture for independent coping. So feeling like your culture expects of you to cope alone, like, you know, find ways of dealing with it by yourself. I think it could also be something around different understandings of mental health. So, for example, Valeria wrote this paper where I think it was among Somali people that the kind of the explanations for being mentally ill could be spiritual, could be like possession. And then maybe it doesn't, then you might think, okay, well, Norwegians suffer from depression. They can go seek help. But we, like, I'm suffering maybe from a jinn, or from some sort of spiritual possession. So there's no point in me going to seek help. Instead, I'm going to go to some religious leader. I'm going to pray. In some Muslim groups, also, there is this idea that maybe illness is a punishment. Illness is a punishment from God, from Allah. And the point, like the reason that you're ill is because you haven't been a good enough Muslim. So I think that could also, there could be some differences there where you recognize Norwegians are different from us. We don't seek help the way they do because we are in a different situation.
Yeah, amazing. But the role of religion has been shown vastly that it really helps with mental health and well-being. And doing these religious rituals, in a way, it has been shown that it's basically mindfulness practice. I was reading a lot of, like, I had a talk online for a university in Pakistan, and I thought, okay, so majority of people, they're Muslim. And I thought I was talking about mind wandering, and I thought I can put mind wandering in a little bit of religion context. And I started to read some papers on how Islamic rituals can help with mindfulness and mental health and well-being. And there was a lot of studies replicated that saying these mantras, praying, saying all these dhikr, they could be helpful for mental health and well-being. So there is also the other side of the religion, that how much it could be helpful. That I do think that if the type of mental health problem that we are going through is kind of a mild one, not moderate or not mature, like major depression disorder or moderate anxiety or like severe panic attacks all the time, or suicidal thoughts or ideation. If it's something mild that you're experiencing, it has been shown that these personal, in a way, beliefs and these rituals, these religious related rituals could be really helpful. But do you have any, like, what is the way forward, like what comes after this? How do you think in your I mean, how did you write about the implications of your studies, that how could it be used in mental health providing services or policy making, and what can be done
Yeah.
both in higher levels of the system, and what can be done personally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I want to say when it comes to religion, for example, you're quite right from what I understand that religion has been shown to, in some cases, be protective for mental illnesses and help people cope, this kind of concept of religious coping, which is obviously very tricky in a secular country like Norway, where religion really isn't something that most people, yes, I think it's almost 50% of the population are registered with the church. But Christians also don't maybe integrate religion into their life in the same way that a lot of Muslims do. So it doesn't have that kind of everyday meaning. And also religion is really kept out of everything. It's kept out of the psychological curriculum of the curriculum for our clinical psychologists, and as well as the doctors, as far as I'm aware, like the medical studies. So for people, I think one of the like take home messages that I had from my interviews with doctors is that all of them felt unprepared to work with people from a different, with refugees with mental health problems. And I think part of that is you're meeting things that you really haven't been exposed to in your studies, like different religions, and the fact that religion is something that you might need to integrate into therapy. You might need to be humble in your approach to someone's religion, because you need to understand what that means to them. So I think each of these kind of individual barriers or things like language and religion, I think all of those individually could together be like a way forward. So maybe if we become a bit better at working with interpreters, or finding a way, maybe also connecting people with therapists that speak their language. if there's some way of improving that, I think that could also help. Or I think generally being aware of these different issues. It's very difficult to say exactly what policy a policymaker necessarily should put through. But I think it's going to be a combination of training for health professionals, which it always hurts a little bit to say that, because I know that health professionals are so overworked and they get sent to trainings for just about anything, you know? So I think it somehow has to be integrated in the curriculum, because the WHO recognizes, so in their report, their 2022 report on the health of migrants and refugees, they make this big claim like it's time to act now. So the biggest health organization in the world recognizes that this isn't just, you know, a recommendation, this is vital. So I think the fact that these issues are still not sufficiently represented in the curriculum needs to change. There needs to be more focus on things like cultural competence or cultural humility, like how do you meet people from other cultures, working with interpreters, how to integrate religion into therapy, all of these different things. And also, very importantly, when we do make policy changes or maybe like develop services, it should ideally be with the involvement of people with lived experience, so that it's not just a top-down process, but it's also something that comes kind of from bottom up. Like what do people think might help? Yeah, so those are some of the things that I would say I would hope that people, yeah, keep in mind.
Sometimes I'm not a professional on this, but just an anecdote, okay? Sometimes when I'm at the gym, I notice that how many of women with like with immigrants or refugee women, because they are Muslims, many of them don't work out. Okay, again, it's just a personal observation, okay? Like I I go to different gyms a lot because I move a lot, and yeah, I have memberships in different gyms, and really it's really rare to see uh Muslim woman workouts, because they also have like the restrictions, and could be hard because you at some point you're sweaty. And I've seen and I admire the Muslim born and raised women in Norway, because now they are just used to wearing the hijab and just go on with their lives. But like many of people like me that came here, live alone, I really think that being physically active should be a part of my life, because I cannot just sit by the TV every evening and think that I'm living alone and I don't have a family here, and how much of TV I'm going to watch, or how many books am I supposed to read. Like, I really need to put myself in a different context where I know it's good for my body and my mind. And so yeah, there are not restrictions that are imposed by society, but restrictions that we impose them to ourselves, um because we just don't feel comfortable being in, yeah, for example, gyms
Yeah.
that are
Yeah, I
not
do.
unisex.
I agree with you. I think that when it comes to like independent coping, what do we do to make ourselves kind of feel better? There's maybe also the culture in Norway, the offers that there are like for exercise, for socializing, maybe they don't suit everybody for religious reasons or other cultural reasons. And exercise being one of them, like with a hijab, maybe also not being able to go swimming or certain exercise classes that you, yeah, obviously I'm not Muslim, so I'm not sure, but I think there's probably something to that as well. That how can we help people help themselves?
Yeah.
No. Hmm.
Oh my god, thank you so much. Do you have anything else to add?
Anything to add? There's one thing that I always want to kind of highlight when I'm talking about this topic, because I think that in the media and in a lot of different contexts when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, there's this expectation or kind of this implicit idea that people with a migrant background, particularly refugees, are traumatized and that they will have mental health problems and that they need professional help. And I just want to really highlight that most people who experience traumatic experiences will never develop PTSD, you know? And I think that's something we also need to remember. People are resilient, people are able to adapt. So when I'm talking about these groups of people with mental illness, that's not the majority. The majority are managing, they're coping, hopefully more, you know, hopefully they're living good lives, and they have found ways to cope themselves. So therapy doesn't have to be for everyone, and we need to learn to help ourselves as well. It's just that the people who do need professional help, who could benefit from professional help, we need to make sure that those people are getting access to the care, and that anything we can do to break down those barriers, that we're trying to do that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun just nerding out for an hour about something that I
Yeah.
really am, you know, very passionate about. So thanks for letting me talk about it.
Um, Please like and subscribe. And if you think it's useful for people like us, that are immigrants, for refugees, for people that have problem coping with the new culture, share it, send it to them. And if you have any questions from Sam, I promise to make her sit here again with me and answer those questions. So just write me an email or just comment it below. Thank you and peace out. You have to say peace out.
Peace out.
Oh.